So take 3. Dougie, when did you first move in here, and what was this room?
This room was Syd's room when we first moved in. I moved in, I'm not exactly sure the date, either just after Christmas 1968 or the beginning of January 1969, around that time. This was Syd's room. It was an unfurnished flat when we moved in, totally empty, bare floorboards. It had a 1-bar electric fire built into the bricked up fireplace over there, concreted up actually, and no furniture. Syd had a mattress on the floor, pile of paintings that had dated from his art school days, probably stereo, guitar, not much else.
And where was the bed?
The bed was initially down there, out there a little bit, and at one point over here, moved around the room. He painted the floorboards, with the bed on the floor over there. I think he painted the floorboards sort of quite quickly. He didn't prepare the floor. Don't even think he swept the floor, actually. I think it was actually quite a lot of dust and things embedded in the paint. And he hadn't planned his route out from the bed that was over there. He painted round the bed, and I think there was a little problem with him getting out the room because he'd painted himself in. So
this room has obviously got tremendous kind of resonance of that time that Syd spent here. And it was a very important creative time for the solo songs, actually.
Yes.
Did you get a sense of that when you were living here with him, that he was going through this creative period?
No, not especially, to be honest. But then you have to remember that most of my friends were creative one way or another. Syd wasn't the only musician friend. I was never aware of Syd being a prolific worker, shall we say, while he was here. I mean, he did write, he did play the guitar, and he did paint, but I wouldn't say prolifically. I would say it was spasmodically.
Tell us a bit about his sort of personal state, his mental state at that time.
Well, when we moved in, he was good company, and he had been good company, and we'd been hanging out sort of as part of a small group that summer in particular, and I'd been to America after I left art school, and then we sort of hooked up when I came back and looked for a flat with another friend called Jules. And initially it was Jules who was the difficult housemate. Then later on it became Syd, but at first, and for quite a while, he was still good company and good to be around. And you know, Syd was a very interesting, charismatic man, for sure. You know, he slowly withdrew from the world, and that withdrawal, a lot of it started while he was here, yes.
Maybe just walk around a bit closer to where the bed was.
Okay, well, the bed was down here for when we first moved in, and this is where it was roughly when he painted the floor. And he had a pile of paintings that were over this end of the room as well. Maybe they were in that side at one point. But certainly the bed then got moved over there opposite the window when, towards the latter period of Syd being here, and he certainly, towards the end of his time here, preferred the darkness. He would keep the curtains permanently pulled, and then he actually pinned up a second layer of fabric over the curtains, so that in fact the windows couldn't be opened, except with difficulty. You had to unpin the fabric to get to the windows, so the room did get a bit smelly later on.
So you're painting a picture of a guy he's kind of withdrawing in this room. I mean, initially...
But it was kind of slow and subtle, and it sounds like I knew he was, whereas I didn't know he was. You know, I didn't really know what was going on in his mind half the time, and it's only sort of a conclusion you think afterwards. You know, as an experience, it was like he was very good company when we first moved in. Then he gradually became, he's getting difficult to live with. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm. coping with being around him that much, yeah, myself. So, yes.
You spend a lot of time in bed.
I think he spent quite a while lying in bed. I used to be in the next room, and I'd be painting, and it was kind of like the wall in between us would sort of cease to exist. And I knew he was lying in bed, sort of thinking, my interpretation was that he was thinking that while he lay there, he had the possibility of doing anything in the world that he chose. But the minute he made a choice, he was limiting his possibilities. So he lay there as long as he could. So he had this unlimited future. But of course, that's a very limited present when you do that, and a very depressing one ultimately. So I think he actually got quite depressed. But I think, you know, once he'd left the band, the motivation, the communal activity of being part of a band, he was then marooned on his own and making music on his own. I don't think he ever really got into or enjoyed that much.
He developed as an artist, as a musician, at a certain point, and then fame arrived.
Fame arrived very suddenly and very dramatically, in that whoosh, they were the centre of everybody's attention, and then he had to be the performing monkey, being on Top of the Pops, playing the same thing again and again, where I think his sense of creativity didn't espouse that. But it was also sudden and not planned, and perhaps very overwhelming. I think it, I mean, certainly from my perception, that certainly would have contributed greatly to what happened to him.
You painted a picture of here's this guy who, you know, he'd been through this arc in a way, from nothing to you know, Top of the Pops stardom, and then by the time he gets to here, he's spending.
He has been in his own mind at 24 or 25, whatever age it was. How much he really held that idea in his own mind, I don't know, because as I said, it's just that once it popped out in conversation, it popped out of the blue.
But it's like the spending a lot of time in bed, not wanting to get up, because once you get up, you limit your choices. I mean, I think that's it seems like the other end of the arc in a way.
Well, certainly if you've had a lot of attention, you thought, hey, I'm not sure I enjoyed that. And then his motivation, he didn't really need to make money, because he had money coming in. I don't think he had a great deal of money coming in, but certainly he had money coming in that would take care of everyday living and food. And that left him with his creative time, but how he chose to use that was his problem. Without that support group around him that the band had been, or that motivating force, I don't know, you know, the egos in the band, who motivated whom most to actually get to that stage.
You mentioned Dave Gilmour being just around the corner. How was his relationship with Syd at that stage?
I think Dave was a very good friend to Syd, as much as anyone could be. Certainly, I think that I don't think the recording sessions would have happened without Dave's both enthusiasm and actual physical getting together of Syd. You know, I think Dave had a lot of positive input into that, and you know, certainly, you know, the two flats were very close by. When we first moved in, Dave used to come and visit here, and his flatmate Francesco, and we would go and hang out there. It was definitely, we'd go around to Dave's quite often, he'd come around here quite often at that point. And then I think slowly that sort of stopped happening, but not something that one was particularly, it wasn't dramatic or anything like that.
A lot of people think it's the story of somebody who's falling apart, and that it's a tragedy. But I keep trying to emphasise, well, there's a whole body of work here, and I think your point about many other people had this breakdown, this far worse than Syd.
I certainly have people in my life who I consider were tragedies in a way that Syd wasn't, for sure. I certainly have people who were drug victims in my life in a way that I don't think Syd was. More dramatically, certainly. More melodramatically, certainly. And Syd certainly became very difficult to be around. How much that was his choice, or in the sense of him consciously wanting to be difficult for people, or how much he was out of control, that becomes debatable. Certainly he did get out of control, I think, eventually, for himself.
Was he a drug casualty?
Well, I read that in all the books, but I coexisted with him for quite a while, not just in this flat and another flat, and my memory of his consumption of drugs doesn't put him on the high list compared to quite a lot of other people who are around. And certainly in terms of behaviour, he wasn't the person who became most difficult first, by a long shot, and so no, I don't see it. I don't believe a lot of the stories I've read. I certainly, I've read about him being spiked with acid every day and locked in a cupboard by a particular couple, and I thought, well, they didn't do that to me. I lived with them too, and I frankly didn't believe the story when I first read it. I read it in a book that didn't identify this couple, but eventually I found somewhere that did identify them, and I thought, they didn't do that to me, and I just didn't believe the story. I do know that people did get spiked with acid at that time. I certainly had someone else tell me they'd been spiked, but Syd never told me he'd been spiked ever. And
I think there was a period, wasn't there, perhaps before he came here, when he was certainly taking quite a bit of acid, developing with Pink Floyd, more of the psychedelic kind of opening up the vistas.
There was certainly a period before we lived here when there was a whole group of people around me who were doing quite a lot of acid. Again, I don't put Syd in the highest acid consumption category of the people I knew. And if he was consuming at a higher rate than I was aware of, then I wasn't aware of it. There were other people who did. I mean, I had one friend who used to take trips every day, and I had another woman friend who said she couldn't go out the house unless she was tripping.
So Syd wasn't like that?
No, not that I was aware of, and certainly not that he articulated. And I actually don't even remember having great acid conversations with Syd when he would be talking about acid and saying what a wonderful, potent thing it was. Whereas I do remember other people saying that, how acid was going to change the world, man. I don't remember having those conversations with Syd, but that was maybe partly because I didn't espouse that philosophy, but I can remember other people saying that to me, not him.
Maybe at the point that he'd moved in here, though,
certainly at the point where he'd moved in here, if he took acid while he was here, he didn't tell me.
But he's perhaps moved away from acid more towards other drugs?
Well, there were drugs around, certainly. There were drugs around every day, wherever we were. Let's from the word go, there were always drugs every day of one sort or another, but usually marijuana, pills of various sorts, ups, downs, speed, mandrax, opium, and early forms of ecstasy, peyote, mescaline. I mean, everybody was experimenting with drugs in general. Cocaine came on the scene a little bit later. Heroin had been around earlier, but not as part of my world, but certainly I'd met heroin users continuously, and heroin destroyed people's lives very quickly a little later on around me.
What about mandrax? Mandrax, I think,
Well, Mandrax I never saw as a destructive drug, but then I had a prescription for Mandrax myself, but I didn't take them in the quantities that a lot of other people did. It was certainly a very used drug at the time, but not on its own. People would smoke, they might maybe have alcohol, and they certainly didn't go with alcohol. Mandrax and alcohol, certainly not a good combination.
I mean, could you see Mandrax as a possible cause of Syd's condition?
No, I think that all those things are catalysts and can contribute, definitely. All those drugs have dangerous sides to them. I think Syd's lack of motivation was his biggest problem, in that once he'd left the band, then his sense of direction, his sense of purpose had gone, and he never reconnected with that. He certainly never really reconnected with his creativity, and in a way that's something that became, I know, if he was difficult for me to live with later on, then I was probably difficult for him to live with, because I would be up working every day and I would paint every day, and I never had any problems with that. It was something that was always the largest part of my daily existence. It still is. And because of that, I was more grounded and more centered. And I think for him, he never found that in himself on his own. And maybe seeing me doing it every day was not great for him, because it accentuated how that he hadn't got that inside himself.
He obviously had to get himself off periodically to Abbey Road for these recording sessions. Do you remember anything of that?
I remember going to one session with him at least, and certainly I remember seeing him sitting on the stool on his own in the middle of the studio, just like a lost soul, and one wondered if he knew where he was, he knew what he was supposed to be doing, or if he was behaving like that deliberately, because then he could suddenly start up and he seemed exactly to know what he was doing. So it was like he was coming and going inside his own head, and you weren't sure whether a lot of it was put on for effect or whether it was really genuine. I think, as I said, at first it may have been put on for effect, and then may have ended up, he got stuck.
I mean, that could explain why he was so maddening to some people, to members of the band. This sense of, is he really just...
Well, I think certainly earlier on, definitely there was an element of play, that he was exercising his power, he was exercising his charisma over people. Even at his best, he would definitely could do that, of sort of, it was a teasing sort of, is he or isn't he, you know, will he or won't he? And certainly there was an element of that at first with Syd that later on became, well, he isn't, he just isn't, you know. I can remember going out with him and getting to the stage when I thought, I'm leading a child around. It's like he's not responding, and this isn't deliberate, he's just not responding. And I was having to tell him when to cross the road, but he would, but he was like an obedient child at that point, but that was not comfortable to be around, and one knew it wasn't really healthy for him.
Is that the point when you felt that somehow you had to separate him from this place?
No, the point that for me was when when Gaylor had left him, and he let the third room to a group of people, in fact 3 people who moved in with pets who are complete strangers to me, and I thought that was too many people to have in that smaller space. And he was being very withdrawn and sullen and difficult. And then suddenly there were all these other people. That was the point for me when I thought, no, I can't do with this anymore. But then I moved somewhere else for a period that was even madder, and was very happy to come straight back here. You know, I moved into someone else's, and I thought, actually, this is a worse madhouse here than living with Syd. So it is relative, you know. I mean, then after he'd let all these people moved in, he found just the constant attention or demands from them too much, and that's when he moved back to Cambridge. And he initially was going to come back, and then he decided not to. It is a long time ago, half a lifetime. We shared a brief part of it together. have some very fond memories and some memories of difficult times, both. It was a big learning curve in my life for sure, and I still appreciate some of his music too. I can still play some of his music with great pleasure. I get curious phone calls from Syd Barrett fans who trace down this address. I've had hordes of Italians, Germans, Scandinavians just turn up at the door. Some I've actually let in. Usually I turn them away and say, look, it's a long time since he lived here, it's my home, it's not, you know, it was only his very briefly. I've had phone calls from America, people wanting to talk about him. Mostly I tried not to talk, but occasionally someone engages one. I had this one who said he was a musician and who was going to be in England very briefly, and asked if he could come and play Syd's his two favourite Syd Barrett songs in the room that Syd wrote them. And I thought that was so wacky that I said, I'll give you 15 minutes. And as he got closer to this person appearing, I thought, oh, was this wise of me? You know, but actually he was quite harmless. I did bury myself in the computer and try not to get drawn into too much communication. He did play his two favourite songs. One was No Man's Land, which I actually think is a very good song. And then he left. You know,
he played.
He played. Yes, he bought his guitar with and played the songs here. And there was a certain poignancy about it, but it wasn't like listening to Syd sing them. And I did think that this man's musical creativity was not going to go very far too. But I didn't communicate that to him.